Representatives of Opticom Pty Ltd. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Paul Cross, CEO of Opticom.
Phil Smith, General Manager, Carrier Relations and Regulatory.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Mr Cross, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
Yes, I would, please.
Thank you.
Opticom, as you will have seen from the introduction contained within our submission, probably has the widest and the most extensive experience within Australia for fibre-to-the-premise GPON deployments. And without our experience and capabilities, we believe it's fair to say that NBN Tasmanian trials would not have met their targets and outcomes. Many of our employees have been involved in fibre-to-the-premise for more than 10 years, and we have had to compete with a virtual monopoly through all of that period, i.e. Telstra, which through its market power and control of key infrastructure, along with a desire to protect existing revenues and plant, have set the pace and the flavour of fibre-to-the-premise rollouts and services for the vast majority of the greenfield developers and their residents currently. We therefore hope that it's not the intent nor the outcome of this legislation that we see the Minister's much heralded structural reform of the telecommunications industry result in even less competition in greenfields. This, we fear, could be the greenfields outcome should we see government policy resulting in NBN Co simply replacing Telstra as the incumbent monopoly and perhaps being even further out of reach of competition due to additional legislation. We haven't had much time to completely review every clause or every outcome of this bill. However, we do know that competition works best when there's a level playing field. And to that end, we have suggested 3 issues that we see may impede the stated and the desired outcome of having competition and choice within greenfield. Just to touch on those points, construction standards should be industry developed. We note in DBCDE's submission of the 23rd of the 5th where they clarified how the bill operates following what they said was some misunderstandings of the apparent actions at the Joint Committee on the NBN hearing of 16th of the 5th, that they say that the government's policy in relation to specifications for use where a developer wishes to use NBN Co, that the specifications shall also be provided to the Communications Alliance with a view of having those specifications endorsed for general use by the industry as soon as possible. I think I'd note here that there are already specifications that are developed for the use of fibre-to-the-premise by carriers today. NBN Co should quite rightly have a specification that is designed to their architecture and their requirements, but this should not become the industry standard, default standard. Comms Alliance, for example, is currently drafting a pit and pipe specification that provides a guide for construction for the requirements that can be used by carriers and designers to ensure a minimum consistent standard is maintained. However, if a particular carrier, for example NBN Co, has specific requirements, then they should only be required to be enforced where an NBN Co installation has been installed. To make their requirements mandatory is an impediment to competition and innovation. Point 2 would be, if the desire is that there should be choice in greenfield, then we should ensure that any legislation is structured so as to ensure, as much as possible, that there does exist a level playing field. It has been raised in various submissions to this committee that backhaul is currently the most inequitable component facing fibre-to-the-premise operators. And from what I can see, this legislation does not appear to address that. NBN is proposing to provide for free the backhaul to greenfield estates, most likely in the future from nearby Telstra infrastructure. However, alternative fibre-to-the-premise operators must currently seek a third-party provider of backhaul, who is most likely much further away than Telstra facility is, and we will therefore incur a much increased cost. The way I see it, this is not much different than the problem that the government's black spot program for non-competitive trunk backhaul has addressed. So we suggest that perhaps greenfield backhaul be treated along the same lines. Perhaps funding the installation of backhaul, or even having NBN provide the backhaul to the boundary of a greenfield estate and having the operational costs declared as a declared service to ensure cost neutrality. Another possibility might be a soft loan scheme that can finance the backhaul build that could be established so that we could provide a more level playing field, so that when we hit the greenfield boundary, we are all competing at the same starting point costs. Point 3, the Statement of Expectations joint media release by the Honourable Julia Gillard, the Honourable Wayne Swan and the Honourable Penny Wong and the Honourable Stephen Conroy, published 20th December 2010, reconfirmed that the expectations of the NBN fibre rollout included that NBN Co will be the wholesale provider of last resort for fibre connections and new developments. And yet this bill does not stipulate this, nor does it provide for this in subordinate legislation. We believe that for this to be achieved, industry must have a level playing field for greenfield networks. The introduction of cost-neutral backhaul to greenfield developers will go a long way towards achieving this. However, an NBN Co network will be offering greenfield developers taxpayers-financed free installation of fibre infrastructure, whilst private networks will need to internally fund this infrastructure. The introduction, perhaps, of government-funded soft loans, perhaps set at a nominated amount per home passed and repaid at NBN Co type rates of return, which were then available to approved carriers who provide NBN equivalent layer 2 wholesale-only equivalent services, would ensure that greenfield developments could be serviced by existing and new operators, offering at a minimum the equivalent services they would get from an NBN Co deployment at the same or lower cost than which it could be from an NBN Co. Opticom has survived and grown even with a David and Goliath environment that we participate in, because we offer variety and value-added services that are valued by the developers and the communities that they service. In our opinion, we would say that the legislation needs to be careful, and regardless of the stated objective of this legislation to allow competition, that we don't put restrictions in place that don't provide the level playing field that's needed to enable it. If you have no competition, you have no incentive for innovation. You have no incentive to offer customers choice and new services. Opticom offers developers, consumers that innovation and those additional services at the speed of change that smaller operators can offer. That's why we've survived. If this legislation stops companies like Opticom from being able to offer these advantages, then we can only have an even poorer outcome than we have today.
Thank you, Mr Cross. I'll hand over to any members who may want to ask any questions. Mr Turnbull.
Raise a proposed amendment that we've discussed with some other witnesses. At the moment, a developer, under the new dispensation, a developer, if has to pay for the pits and pipes to be fibre ready. If the development is 100 house premises or more, then the NBN supposedly will connect those premises up to fibre, although whether they do so in a timely fashion, no doubt, would be the big issue for many of your customers. And for less than 100, Telstra will run copper through those pits and pipes. That's your understanding?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. The problem that's we've been alerted to is firstly the question of the timeliness of NBN's response, and secondly the fact that this really disadvantages a development that gets fibre versus one that's got copper, because clearly there's a marketing opportunity there if nothing else. It's been put to us, and we're reflecting on a possible amendment to the legislation which would have this effect. that a developer would have the ability to engage a company like yourselves or one of your peers to install fibre in the development in accordance with technical standards that would be laid down by ACMA, which I think would meet another one of your concerns after consultation with the NBN, and that assuming that the network was in that area was installed in accordance with those specifications, then the developer would be able to require the NBN to buy those network assets from it at an agreed or a stipulated price per household. I think you've suggested $1,500 per household, but that's something that would have to be resolved. So in other words, a developer wouldn't have to hang around waiting for the NBN to show up. He wouldn't have to be disadvantaged by having copper on what is supposed to be an interim basis, but could be quite a long interim basis. He could take the matter into his own hands, engage you, put in the fibre, and then get paid by NBN. Now, if an amendment of that kind were to be recommended by this committee, what are your comments on that? Does that meet some of your concerns, all of your concerns? Can you tell us what you would say about that?
Our business model is one where we build, own and operate the network.
Well, can I just interrupt you there, because I should have added a footnote to that. The developer, having done that, put in that network, would then be in a position of either operating it himself or putting it... I mean, clearly you can't force somebody to sell something to the NBN, but they'd have the right to do so, is what I'm saying.
First time I've heard of that concept, but from a minute of thought about it, I think there would be some advantages to what is currently proposed in what you're saying. I think that allows diversity in the greenfield, where, as I said, we have been successful because not only do we offer broadband and voice, but we offer a number of other services that some developers find attractive. It would still allow them to do that and allow them to keep that network operating through companies like ourselves, or it allows them the offer to transfer that ownership to NBN Co. I think that's what you're suggesting. I would never love to build a network and see it go to someone else. But the concept, I think, is better than where we stand today.
Okay, how would you, with the networks you build, own and operate, how will you interact with the NBN? Do you have an understanding how that's going to work in the future?
Interact with them?
Well, will the NBN overbuild you, or do you just hook into the NBN? Do you peer with the NBN? How does it work?
I'll answer that. Basically, like happens today, where there is, we do operate separate networks to Telstra, to NBN. Today, the interconnection of services happens at points of interconnect. We run our own points of interconnect, where the retail service providers connect to our network. So therefore, the commonality of the networks is at the retail service provider level. We run our own fully operational mini NBN, if you want to call it that, in that we have our own points of interconnect that the retailers connect to. It's a very successful model that we've developed over the last 5 years. That is the model which NBN has modelled itself on. We are the original model. So we don't have to interconnect with NBN as per se, but all those retailers that are on NBN are on our network as well.
But do you understand? Is it your understanding that NBN plans to overbuild you in the areas where you are already established?
It's not our understanding. Our understanding is that if a network is providing the level of services required by an NBN co level of services on fibre, then it won't be overbuilt.
Okay.
And we operate it to a wholesale-only open access model.
So the point that I've addressed, you've had something to say about, but if in a greenfield network, you're going to be at somewhat of a disadvantage, aren't you? Because you'll be going to a developer and saying, I want to build a network here in this residential subdivision, which we, Opticom, will own and operate, versus the NBN, and presumably you'd ask the developer to pay something towards that. How much would the developer normally contribute to that?
Well, typically our contribution that we ask for the developer is, depending on the type of functions they want, can vary from $1,500 to $1,800 a lot. Okay,
but they will have your competitive problem will be that the NBN will be offering to do it for nothing.
That's correct.
And I guess that's what we're stating here, the level playing field. It needs to start. We believe that there is some developers who appreciate, as I said, some additional services that we're able to, and we may be able to market those. But other than that, we need to be on a level playing field.
Okay. So have you joined with Open Networks in the submission to the Productivity Commission about the competitive neutrality inquiry?
No, we haven't at this stage.
No. Well, it's maybe something you should... Sounds like you've got the same concern. You probably...
We're sympathetic with their cause.
Pardon?
Yeah, we're sympathetic to their statements.
Yeah, well, you might want to make a contribution to that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on one point before I hand over to Senator McDonald? Just in relation to the level playing field, and a lot of the questions that have been put to you by Mr Turnbull go to who is the provider of the fibre itself. What you have identified in relation to the bill that's currently before this committee, do you understand this bill goes to the providing of the fibre-ready infrastructure, as in the pit and pipe, as opposed to the discussions that are now being had, which is who should be the deliverer of the fibre itself? Is that your understanding of the bill that's currently before this committee?
You're saying that this bill covers only the pit and pipe?
That is the purpose of this bill, other than the statement made by the Minister in the explanatory memorandum going to NBN being a provider of last resort. The bill itself is dealing with the fibre-ready infrastructure. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it's my understanding that this bill is about the fibre-ready infrastructure, but we believe that it goes further than that, in that you just can't define that, because if a developer chooses a different provider, that pit and pipe may vary, because all pit and pipes aren't the same. It depends on the carrier that goes into that network. It depends it can alter the design of the pit and pipe. My pit and pipe that we design as Opticom is different to NBN, it's different to Transact, it's different to other carriers. We all work on a base level of understanding of the standards that Comms Alliance set up, but we all have our own variations of that. So it's very important to understand who the carrier is before you actually deliver a pit and pipe to a particular development.
Is yours cheaper than NBN's?
We believe we are.
Because I know Transact has said theirs is a lot less expensive.
So the issue for Opticom in relation to this bill is the specifications that are being outlined by NBN for...
We're concerned that a private organisation, which essentially NBN Co has been set up as a corporatised entity, be it owned by the government, is that they should not be the standards body. I actually have another hat that I chair, the Comms Alliance Early Stage Deployment Committee, where we're defining those standards for pit and pipe, and it is of that committee's understanding that it's the Comms Alliance that sets standards, not NBN Co, not one organisation, not one of the members of Comms Alliance should set the standard. It should be a industry body that sets the standard.
I'm also concerned that within this legislation the Minister is allowed to make decision on standards. I'm not sure the purpose of that.
So can I just go back to one of the comments you made at the end of your statement, which is if this legislation stops Opticom from being competitive, that you have real concerns. Where does this bill, as it currently stands, stop you from being competitive?
If this is just talking about pit and pipe?
Well, it's talking about the bill that the committee, so where you've stated that if this bill stops you being competitive, I'd like to hear from you where in this bill it stops you being competitive.
If we look at, as I said, we need to look at what we are delivering in a development. That development includes multiple aspects. So it's the backhaul, it's the pit and pipe infrastructure, and then it's the fibre connectivity that goes with that. We need to ensure that when we get to the boundary that we are competing on the same basis as NBN Co.
I think the challenge is that the developer has to make a choice early in the development cycle of which carrier they will go with, whether they sign an NBN contract or go with a private provider. The bill doesn't really clearly outline that they have a choice of providers, that it just talks about fibre-ready infrastructure to an NBN standard, and to us that is limiting competition.
Chair, can I just ask?
Yes,
Just on that issue, just taking that one step further in terms of the consumer, the end user, where does the end user get any sense of choice in this situation? So, if as the developer you choose one provider, at what point can the purchaser of one of your homes or apartments actually have choice in the provider that they want?
We are the same model as NBN Co. We are a wholesale-only open access provider. We have a range of service providers that connect to our network, and the end user communicates their requirement or takes a contract with one of those retail service providers. We currently have, I think it's the current number is over 10 retail service providers that connect to our points of interconnect around Australia, and so all those residents in all our estates have that choice today.
And just on the other point about, as in your other role as chair of the other committee, what discussions have you had around the issue of compatibility of different pit and pipe designs?
We all agree that the base standard is the same. The types of pits, the types of conduit and so on that constitutes a pit and pipe are all common to the industry. And we had some early discussion and feedback to NBN Co. In fact, some of the early specifications that they put out did not meet some of those basic building blocks that we currently use in Australia. For example, the pit sizes were quite different to the way the traditional pit sizes that Telstra and ourselves and Transact and everyone else used. They have changed the specification on pressure from that committee. There's a lot of things like that where the basic building blocks are all the same. It's the way you construct that and according to the architecture you need to then put in will vary. So NBN's guidelines, as they put out, and by the way, they're up to the 4th variation of that, just about to publish the 5th, which is really a surprising number of variations in less than 6 months. It's very hard for the developer to understand which spec to use. It's like a moving target for them. So if you look at Transact or ourselves or even Telstra in the old days, we all had a fairly standard pit and pipe design. We did vary slightly from each other, but they were all basically the same. NBN's specification was quite different initially. It's coming more back into the fold, if you like, of the standards that Comms Alliance had set.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Senator McDonald.
Look, just a couple of things. When Mr Turnbull asked you or mentioned a possible amendment, you said you hadn't thought of it before. Could I just ask you to sort of take that on notice, think about it, and perhaps let the committee know, if that would address some of the concerns you have, and perhaps if it doesn't,
Can I just clarify exactly what that option was again? Can I just have that again?
The way it would work is a developer could employ a constructor, a contractor, to put fibre into his or her development, and if that was done in accordance with specifications determined by ACMA that were developed in line with the NBN, then the developer would be able to require the NBN to, in effect, buy that network, those network assets from him for a price. Now, that price, what we've had from various developers is a suggestion that it should be effectively a tariff of so many dollars per household. The point there is it doesn't address your issue of being you're really about competitive neutrality as an operator of a network.
Yes.
This addresses the issue of competitive neutrality from the point of view of constructors of networks. So that's I think the feedback we've had is that it does address that issue at least, but your concern, I mean, can I just, so I've answered your question
Yes,
to
thank
me.
you.
Can I just come back to you with a question? Well, I've got you. The requirement to have NBN ready pit and pipe, does that disadvantage you? Or, I mean, because you can run your cables through NBN, the pit and pipe infrastructure.
We can.
Yeah.
It does disadvantage.
It disadvantages the developer, you would say. So your issue with that would be that on the basis that NBN standard pit and pipe costs more than Opticom
That's
pit
correct.
and pipe, or indeed I think as we'll hear from Transact pit and pipe, the developer, and if the developer were to ultimately go with you or Transact, for example, he would have paid more for his pit and pipe than he needed to. But it
Yes,
doesn't
that's
inhibit you.
That's one issue.
Yeah.
The other issue is the NBN code specification requires, physically it's a different size. Our experience within the greenfield with our developers is that sometimes the NBN solution would be impractical for greenfield development.
Okay.
For us, it would involve additional cost to the developer to accommodate that design.
Their design.
Their design, yeah.
The issue is because there's a lot more pit and pipe going in and bigger pits and so on, the use of the pavement and so on area, if you've ever been to one of the new estates that are being built today in like southwest Sydney or wherever, you'll notice that the footpaths and the roadways are a lot smaller than they used to be. So the developer is quite constrained because of the cost of land is so high. They're trying to reduce the amount of road space and obviously make more money by selling more lots of land. But essentially, there is a restriction in the pathways that is a bit of a challenge. And we've done NBN design, and we've had in our company for developers, and it's been a challenge to fit some of their design specs into a new development.
Which is why we need choice. It might be applicable in some areas, but in others it wouldn't be. For our solution.
Can I just check, Senator McDonald, did you...
I just had a couple of other quick questions.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
And then I'll hand over to Senator Cameron.
Again, from the Chair put to you earlier, was your understanding of the bill as she related it to. I understood you to say you weren't confident that that was the correct interpretation. I wonder, have you spoken to the department?
Certainly not my understanding of the response I got, but we'll let the witnesses
Oh, well,
clarify
okay.
that.
Well, if they agreed with you, then that stops my question then and there.
I understood Mr Smith to say, yes, that was your understanding.
We do
but-
understand that it is, the bill before the Parliament at the moment is about pit and pipe, fibre-ready infrastructure, which is pit and pipe.
But I thought you said you thought the bill went further than that.
No, all I was saying is that we believe the bill should go further.
Okay. So you're absolutely confident.
Which is a different...
No, I understand that, but I gathered wrongly, as it appears, that your interpretation was different to an interpretation the chair had given. So you're quite confident you understand what the bill restricts you to do, or otherwise?
Yes, absolutely. Look,
Okay.
I'm aware of the fibre-ready infrastructure bill. Yes.
Okay, then I got that wrong. And look, just finally from me, and I was late for your presentation. If you've addressed this, please don't repeat it, or if someone else had asked you the question. You talk about NBN in your submission. You talk about that the bill shouldn't stipulate NBN standards, and then you've got in brackets which have never been peer reviewed. What do you mean by never been peer reviewed? I mean, who peer reviews these sorts of things, and what's that actually
Peer
mean?
reviewing is the process that we do in Comms Alliance, essentially. Communications Alliance is an industry body set up to set standards, sets codes of practice, and to peer review anybody's innovation or design. So when something, new technology comes along or whatever, it's very dangerous for one company or one designer to come up with a design without really passing it past his peers to see if it is a valid and robust compatible way of doing things. So in a lot of cases, NBN Co, we have publicly criticised on a number of occasions the lack of peer review of a lot of the design of NBN.
So peer review in this case will be like with ECMA through Comms Alliance.
So do you think the legislation should be changed to, and I think you've sort of indicated this, that the Communications Alliance should be able to peer review NBN's requirements before the NBN put that requirement upon you?
It was an interesting, in the Comms Alliance that I chair, it was interesting that NBN Co came to that committee with the intent to change the standard to their standard, but I think they now realise that the committee has set a standard that they have to harmonise, as they call it, their design to.
But they're not required to under this legislation.
No.
Under this legislation, they can say to Comms Alliance and the rest of you, go and get lost. This is what we want. This is what you're going to have to do, whether you like it or not.
It's almost enforcing on the industry a one standard.
That's
That's our concern.
So your suggestion would be that the legislation should actually nominate. Now, is the Communications Alliance? Is it an incorporated group?
Yes,
What's its stand? What's its?
It's an incorporated body. It's been around for some years. It's got a board. It's got quite elaborate premises in North Sydney. It's been around. It has something like 9 subcommittees for NBN specification.
It's a not-for-profit.
It's a non-profit. It's an industry body. We all pay within the telecommunications industry. Everyone pays into it. Optus, Telstra.
Will NBN be paying into it?
NBN pays into it. They are
Already?
a member. They are a member of Comms Alliance. Yes, Communications Alliance.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Senator Cameron?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Cross. Does Mr. Stephen Davies still work for Opticom?
Oh, yes, he does.
Yeah. I just noticed on your website, Mr. Davies is quoted as he's the General Manager of Operations.
Operations.
Yep. He welcomed the announcement by the government as an important critical decision. That's the NBN. Then he goes on to say that he's been in communications for 22 years, and that prior to joining Opticom, he had been a vocal critic of NBN based on fibre to the node. Is that correct?
He'd been a critic of the fibre to the node proposal, yes, the pre-NBN.
It's on your website.
Yeah,
So I'm just-
that
I
is
don't
correct.
I'm not trying to ambush you.
That is correct, though.
Yeah,
Mr. Cameron.
It then goes on to say, because it was going to deliver because it was not, fibre to the node would not deliver the world-leading broadband infrastructure this nation needed. Already some 30 countries have started to roll fibre to the home on a large scale, and be that driven via government strategy or private investment. Then he goes on to say, for Australia to have built a network using outdated technology, that's fibre to the node, it would have left us as a technology backwater and placed us at a significant disadvantage to other countries in the global knowledge economy. So that's still Opticom's position?
We've been passionate from the first day that we started operation that fibre to the premise was the way to go. We're still very passionate about that.
Yeah.
It's why we got involved with NBN Tasmania Stage 1, that we rolled that part of it out. It's why we started the business and started it in a wholesale-only open access model from day one.
Yeah. So, obviously you've been going, 8 years?
We incorporated the company in 2005, but didn't really operate in earnest till 2007.
I must say, I knew Hills Industries in South Australia. I used to be on their plant now and again as a union official, and they've certainly broadened out. So when did the Hills Industry take...
October 2007, they took a 50% equity stake in the company.
So they must have known then that there was a proposal for an NBN from...
2007 there wasn't. It was still under the Liberal government.
Right, so that was... Right, that must have been the start of 2007. Okay, your website talks about the opportunities of an NBN.
Yes.
You're now talking about the negatives for the company. What are the opportunities? Are you discussing with NBN or government the opportunities for a company like yours who have been out there, done, pioneered a lot of the stuff? Surely there's got to be an approach where the NBN can be positive for you, because you actually say the NBN is modelled on your business model.
Correct. And we're very positive about our fibre to the premise. We're not necessarily agree wholeheartedly with the design and the implementation of NBN today, but we are still very passionate about what fibre to the premise delivers to end customers. We have been involved very heavily in pilot schemes, for example at Parkbridge. New South Wales Government sponsored NBN trials for IPTV, for e-education, e-health applications. We've pioneered a lot of the fibre-based applications and we continue to pioneer some of those. We're working at the moment with a IPTV provider, a major IPTV provider.
Smart Grid.
And we've also done Smart Grid trials. So we're probably 3 or 4 years ahead of NBN in terms of applications on our networks today. As I say, we're very passionate about it, Senator Campbell. But we don't necessarily 100% agree with the way NBN is rolling out. Now, where that leaves us in the bigger picture of how we compete into the greenfield market, which is our traditional market, is the question to us.
Yeah. Is there opportunities for partnerships with NBN? Because I'm just looking at what you said when the announcement was made. Phil Smith, yourself. You. It's you. It's you.
So if I can just interrupt for 1 minute, I will remind the Senator that we're here asking about the bill, not the broader NBN inquiry.
Sure.
And I'm just mindful of the time, so
I think
maybe another one more question and I'll pass over
wide.
to Mr Hardsucker.
Chair, which others in this room could well...
I thought we've been pretty flexible. So if the rule applies to me, I want it applied all the way, but that's okay. Ma-
She does,
Yeah.
Doug, you might leave.
Okay, keep going. I'm trying to give the Senator more time.
I'll just
more
finish
questions.
up. And it is, you say, you said, Mr. Smith, that the structure of the new NBN company being an open access wholesale only service provider is the model Opticom has been operating under since its creation. We adopted this model because we believe it's the only way the telecommunications market should operate, with a network owner being totally separated from the retailing of services.
Correct.
You then got to say retailers know they are being treated equally and on a level playing field, which is all they have asked for over the past 12 years of deregulation in Australia. Well, we've had evidence from the Productivity Commission this morning that they told the Howard government in 2001 that they had to break the vertical integration and nothing was done. Again, I put it to you, what opportunities are there for you as there ongoing discussions between Opticom and NBN or the government to try and, provide some, way through this for your company?
We have, and we've tendered and we continue to tender for opportunities. At this stage, we've been not successful other than the opportunity to do NBN Stage 1, NBN Tasmania Stage 1. We continue to operate that. We have a contract till June next year with to operate NBN Tasmania Stage 1. We built all the active equipment nodes, the fibre access nodes. We built the point of interconnect. We built the network operations centre. We did the big demonstration with the big blue button was pushed. That was all us that did all that. Now, that's the contract we currently have, and we're hoping for other contracts. But our primary business is in delivering, designing, building and operating our own networks for Greenfield.
You would consider yourself experts in this, would you?
Absolutely.
And your expert analysis is that fibre to the home is far superior than fibre to the node.
I genuinely believe that. No, I genuinely believe that. I do agree with that.
Not fibre to the node was the way to go. Why can't
Well,
we
that
pay
is
for
true.
this?
That is, there has been questions on the copper and the
But I'm
fibre
biased.
alternatives. But if you can answer that question, and then I'll give Mr. Hartsucker, because I'm mindful we're already over time.
I'm
So-
biased because I've built my whole business around fibre
You're
to
an
premise.
expert, you told me, Mr. Smith.
That's a good bias to have.
Unlike Mr. Turnbull, who's not.
Mr. Hartsucker.
Yeah, but they get the market to pay for it. They don't get a government subsidy in a monopoly situation.
Mr. Hartsucker.
We've touched on this in a number of different ways, but could you just list the ways in which the NBN standard is varying from what the industry developed standard is?
For the pit and pipe?
Yeah.
It's the number of trunk conduits where we might put 1 or 2 by 50 conduits. They'll put 3 or 4 by 100s. If we put a P5 pit, which is I don't know whether you know the size pits, but if they put a P5, they might put a P6 or even bigger P8. So everything is supersized, if you want to call it that.
So it's basically purely the size of the.
It's just the number of conduits and the size of pits varies.
Their architecture leads them to having to require that.
Well, they don't have to worry about money.
Sorry?
They don't have to worry about money.
No.
And what's the cost differential as a percentage?
Sorry?
For the pit and pipe, how much more expensive is the larger infrastructure?
We have seen quotes for the NBN and done design of the NBN spec versus our spec, and we think it's double the price.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your evidence today. I don't think we had a question on notice, although I did have a note. Senator McDonald did give you a question on notice. Yes, just one clarification.
You said double the price of the actual conduits and so on and so forth, because by the time you've opened up a trench, surely
all these prices that we give, that even the UDIA, I was sitting in when you were talking to the UDIA, and they gave that $800 to $1,000 figure. That's assuming there's an open trench.
Right.
Always assumes an open trench.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, and the same for ours. It assumes an open trench.
So what's your figure? What would be your figure versus NBN?
We quote developers $450 a lot to do
and
pit and
NBN
pipe.
you think's about 900.
Well, the UDIA said 8 to 1,000, 800 to 1,000.
Okay.
Before I just get Senator McDonald to clarify whether there is a question on notice, can I just put one point on your response on double the price? Despite it being double the price, you did bid for, was successful in rolling out the Tasmanian program, so you still think it's affordable to do as a company because you chose to tender for it?
We were brought into NBN Tasmania for the reason that we were the experts, perceived to be the experts in the field. We had been doing it, and to the NBN model. How we've designed stage 1 of Tasmania is very different to the way they're moving forward with the rest of the rollout. We did it in our model rather than to NBN's model, and that was a pragmatic decision at the time to get NBN Tasmania up and running in the time that they did.
Can I, Senator McDonald, do you want to just clarify, or maybe Opticom's very clear on the question on notice?
Well, it was just about whether you
Yeah, no, we understand that.
Yes.
Can I advise then that having a question on notice, because this committee is seeking to consider report on this bill in a timely manner, that we would ask that you provide a response by midday Monday to the Secretariat on that question. Thank you for attending today to assist the committee with its review of the fibre deployment bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next witnesses are Transact. I now welcome the representatives of Transact. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
My name's Ivan Slavich. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Transact, and with me is Peter Lee, GM Strategy, Wholesale and Regulatory Affairs.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Mr Slavish, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chair. And I'd like to first thank the Chair and the committee for the opportunity for Transact to speak today with regard to the inquiry to the Fibre Deployment Bill 2011 and answer any questions that you may have. Transact should need no introduction to the Joint Committee. We've had significant involvement with the development of policy and consulting throughout the process with the department and with the Minister and with relevant stakeholders, including related policy and legislation. So I thought I'd just give a little bit of background just in case you weren't fully aware of who Transact was. We've been around for over 10 years and we've operated and built advanced fibre optic based networks for that period of time. We have a mixture of fibre-based networks which pass approximately 200,000 Australian premises in the areas of the ACT, Queanbeyan, Geelong, Ballarat and Mildura. More recently, in the last 5 years, we've been quite active in deploying fibre to the premise as the latest form of technology, particularly to greenfield sites. So we now have 16,500 premises that are now under contract for us to deploy fibre to the premise to, most notably in the ACT, in the northern suburbs of the ACT and the big growth corridor in the Molonglo Valley. And as we speak, we have 4,500 premises passed and 2,100 premises that are now actively deployed with fibre to the premise. And to those premises we deploy voice, data, IPTV and free-to-air television via RF overlay signal. What that means is houses don't need to put TV antennas on their roofs. We've also have an open access network, so we provide layer 3 open access to approximately 11 ISPs on our network. We absolutely agree with the government's policy and with this bill in the sense of building fibre optic cable in greenfield sites. We think it'd be counterproductive not to do that. We liken putting copper into new estates with like putting clay pipes into houses many years ago. So that's why we've embarked in deploying fibre to the premise in greenfield estates since 2006. However, Transact believes that there are a number of provisions in this specific piece of legislation that, if amended appropriately, would improve the desired outcome for all stakeholders. And the main amendments that we'd like to see put into the legislation is amending the developer's contribution from the fibre-ready pit and pipe requirement to a capped financial contribution methodology or price threshold that was proposed in the original draft legislation of the 2010 Fibre Deployment Bill. And secondly, where timing precludes a Communications Alliance industry-wide endorsed code or a standard applying in the bill, that as a default measure the fibre-ready conditions should be those specified by a licensed and accredited carrier, not conditions as determined by the Minister. And thirdly, Transact believes that an appropriate percentage of the USO, i.e. the Universal Service Obligation subsidy, should still be made available to the private sector based on contestability and a universal service arrangement should they assume similar responsibilities to that of a primary universal service provider, such as NBN Co or a USO Co. So we understand that the bill addresses the requirements to ensure fibre-ready facilities and optical fibre lines are installed in new developments. The impacts of this bill, together with the government's overarching NBN policies supporting legislation and initiatives, significantly affects the competitive landscape for future fixed-line infrastructure competition in Australia. In this context, Transact believes that the committee needs to consider not only the potential impacts of specific provisions within the Fibre Deployment Bill, but the greater impact on how this piece of legislation, together with the government's overall NBN policy framework, looks to enshrine the NBN Co as a monopoly provider of fixed-line services in Australia, potentially displacing the private sector from the market altogether.
Thank you very much. Questions from members? Mr Turnbull.
Mr Slovich, you were here with Mr Lee when I was describing the amendment that we were considering. I won't repeat it because you heard it in the room. Can you give us your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, essentially, we believe that having a situation where the developer puts in pit and pipe into the development creates a situation where you have a threefold, a tripartite type arrangement. You've got the developer putting in pit and pipe, and then you've got a fibre operator coming in subsequent to that. So what we typically do what we typically provide to developments is a turnkey solution. Yep. So we deploy the fibre and the pit and pipe all together to the actual developer. And we believe that having a situation where it's pit and pipe only is not necessarily the best outcome overall. So
in the amendment I flagged earlier, that would probably fit in with your approach, because the developer could hire you or somebody else to do pit and pipe and fibre at the same time, and then choose either to operate that with you or Opticom as an independent network, or alternatively, under the amendment I'm canvassing, in effect put that back to the NBN.
Yeah, that's right. So we would support that type of amendment to the legislation.
Okay. So just to be clear, but the point you're making is that there's merit in, rather than the developer doing the pit and pipe and then waiting for the NBN to show up, just being able to get it all done at once by a suitably qualified person.
That's right, and particularly during this transitional period, I mean, the requirement is for NBN Co to be the supplier of last resort, not necessarily the supplier of first resort. And we obviously want to continue to operate in this space. All the new greenfield developments in the ACT have been deployed using fibre to the premise with Transact. So we'd like to continue to do that. And obviously we have to comply with the requirements of the Access Act as well. And we gave a fair bit of evidence and views in terms of that legislation as well. So obviously we'd have to comply with the requirements under that Act as well. But yeah, we would support that amendment.
Just on that.
Sorry,
Not in contradiction to what you're saying, but just more for clarification.
Yeah, sure.
So there are two. You could either have the pit and pipe installed by, well, for example, you might have someone with boring equipment who does all that work, and then someone else comes later to do the actual, like backhaul the cable through, or in your case, is what you're saying, you've got the capability to do both at once.
Yeah, well, we think it's much more efficient to actually do both at the same time rather than put pit and pipe and then later on have fibre coming through, because it avoids that situation. I think if you have that situation where you put pit and pipe and then wait for someone to come along later on to put fibre, is that you may be confronted with situations where a homeowner isn't, it's not ready to go in when that homeowner's wanting to have the fibre deployed. Whereas with our model, that doesn't happen. We are always there ready to be to deploy fibre to the premise when the homeowner wishes to move in.
Thanks. Just one final question. We heard from Opticom about the relative cost of their pit and pipe versus the NBN model or version. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your pit and pipe approach costs versus what you understand NBN's requiring?
Well, certainly. There are a lot of numbers that are on the record by other suppliers. Typically, Transact doesn't disclose that information because that is commercial in confidence, and we actually all compete with each other when it comes to deploying these new developments. So it's not something I'd like to have on the Hansard. However, I can sort of give... I was noting it down. But
your secret's safe. We're all politicians.
Yeah, but look, I think what I can quote is what others have stated, and I think they are ballpark type numbers. And the ballpark type numbers indicate that pit and pipe is somewhere in the order of $500 to $1,000 a premise, and a turnkey solution is anywhere up to $3,500 a premise, depending on who deploys it and what the specification is. And that's one of the reasons why we'd like to see an amendment to the legislation whereby the technical standard is not set by the minister, because the concern that we have is that it may be a specification that is too costly. I mean, we absolutely positively deploy a fibre network to the premise. With our deployment, we offer 10, 30 and 100 megabits per second to the homeowner. We offer a multicast closed-loop IPTV service to the home, an RF overlay, a UPS backup, and there's no... So from our specification absolutely delivers what's required to the premise. What we're concerned about is if a more, I guess, let's call it a gold-plated type specification is put in place, then that'll just increase the cost unnecessarily.
Just finally, so your major concern though is not as a constructor. I mean, you do construct these networks, but your major concern, like Opticom, is with the way this impacts on you as an operator of networks, and you do operate a very large broadband network at the moment. That's right.
Absolutely. I mean, what we ask for is a level playing field, and so that we can compete on like terms. As it is, it will be difficult for us as a smaller operator from an economies of scale perspective to compete with NBN Co. I mean, they'll obviously are awarding multi-million-dollar contracts, and from an economies of scale perspective, we need to compete with that. But we think, like as the Opticom witnesses indicated, we are very flexible. We believe that we're very innovative. We are very customer service oriented, and our developers are delighted with the services that we do provide them. So we believe that we can provide a value proposition to developers and to homeowners, But what we ask for is a level playing field, and that we don't get dictated to in terms of that specification. Obviously, the specification does need to meet standards.
And who do you think should set the specification?
We believe anyone that has a carrier's licence and is suitably accredited should be suitably qualified to set that specification. Although we are a member of the Communications Alliance, and I note you mentioned ACMA before. So it's, I guess what we want to avoid is having an over-engineered specification.
Yeah.
Can I say to that? When I was talking about the Comms Alliance specification, we also are a member of the Comms Alliance working group on early stage deployments and looking at that specification. And we would like to see that it's an industry specification, not necessarily an NBN code specification. But what the bill does at the moment, as a default, given that there is no Comms Alliance industry endorsed specification, the bill defaults to the Minister having the powers to set those specifications for the fibre ready and also the optical fibre line requirement.
Yeah.
And we don't agree necessarily that that should be the case. If as per in our submission, we talked to this and we put forward a recommendation as to an amendment, and we basically say that as an alternative, it should be a licensed carrier specification. So if the Mr. Developer wants to go to NBN code for his solution, he would be expected to comply with NBN code specification for pit pipe and optical fibre lines. If he goes to Transact for his solution, you would expect he would comply to Transact specifications. And this is as a default in lieu of not having a Comms Alliance spec.
So you have your own standards that you expect subbies would follow if they're working on your network?
But our standards also comply with current industry standards in relation to the types of conduits, the pits, the markings.
But the subbies don't work to their own standards; they work to yours.
In a development?
Correct.
Yep.
Yes, that's correct.
But you say that should default to that, but your preference would be for a Comms Alliance ability to set the standard.
Correct. Yeah.
Have you any idea why the government didn't pick that up in its drafting the legislation? I mean, have they given you any reason? And you're a major player in the area. They may have confided in you as to why they didn't do that.
Oh, I mean, my understanding is that because there is not currently a Comms Alliance specification for pit and pipe. And in lacking that currently, the bill defaults to the Minister being able to have the discretion to set those standards. And what we're afraid of is that the Minister will set NBN code standards as the minimum spec, which then makes it an anti-competitive and inflexible playing field for other private sector providers.
But do I get this right, that although you have your own standard, you pass it across Comms Alliance before you implement it, so that others in your industry think that they could connect in if the need arose, or that they think it's not a bad idea?
Yeah, we certainly communicate that as part of that process.
So they approve your standard?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, we work with developers, and we are a licensed carrier, and of course, as a prudent licensed carrier, we need to set a standard that deploys the correct services to the end customer. The last thing we want to do is deploy a service that doesn't set the requirements that we would like delivered. So we deliver. I mean, our delivery is a GPON, Gigabit Passive Optical Network standard that's utilising Alcatel-Lucent kit, Corning fibre, and in fact, the standard that we put in is actually above what NBN code will provide in terms of RF overlay. So we provide an RF overlay to the premise.
But accepting that there's a thought around that you shouldn't be your own judge, sort of thing, and looking at as a last resort it goes to NBN, which is the Minister, which is the NBN you're worried about. Is there a way that you could facilitate a third party, i.e. the Comms Alliance, to be...
I mean, we would be satisfied with working with the carriers in this space through the Comms Alliance to set that standard.
Is it able to be done legislatively? I mean, can you...
it could be. I mean, if there was a Comms Alliance standard that was already set and agreed to by the industry, certainly the legislation could refer to that standard. So or a Comms Alliance code, whatever it might be. But currently that standard doesn't exist.
So to do that, Comms Alliance would have to set a standard.
Correct.
It's not sufficient to say, well, look, we'll use our standard, providing an independent third party like Comms Alliance sort of says it's not bad.
Yep. And as pointed out earlier, NBN Co is part of that Comms Alliance as well.
Yeah.
So
NBN Co is also on that working group.
Yeah. So again, I'm not sure you answered me. Do you know why the government didn't go along with that? Have they shared that with you?
Well, as I said, I think it's because there isn't currently a agreed standard that's been set by the Comms Alliance, which is why the government hasn't specified a specific Comms Alliance standard.
Would it be hard to get comms?
Well, my understanding is it's being worked on at the moment, and as Phil Smith from Opticom said in his previous statement, he's the chair of that working group, and that working group is actually currently working very hard to come to a point where that standard is actually set. There's representatives from NBN Co, from Telstra, Transact, even representatives from the department on that working group, and they are working hard to come to that standard.
So it's your default, the default bit that you're worried about,
correct,
leaving it to the minister.
And the minister then
As
setting
aside,
NBN, and then the minister then setting NBN.
I don't want you to comment on this, but leaving anything to this minister would be a concern to me, not to you perhaps, but to me.
Senator, I don't mean to pull you up specifically at that point, but I'm mindful of the time, so I just want to check if you've got many more questions. Senator Cameron, and then Mr Hartsucker, and I'll see who else I've got left, Mr Husick. So we might, mindful we've got at least 3 more members who want to ask questions.
Okay.
I'll hand over to Senator Cameron.
Thanks, Mr Slavic. Why don't you have an industry standard?
it's a good question. I guess the reason that's the case is that it has been a very competitive environment, and there's no question that the fibre to the premise that has been deployed thus far has been absolutely adequate to meet consumers' needs. My answer to that would be it's probably more because of the competitive environment. So Transact, Opticom, Converge, Pivot, Open Networks, all these companies have competed with each other in these developments. And I guess it's more of a function of the NBN Co coming into existence, whereby the industry now recognises that there is that need to set that standard and is working hard to develop that standard.
So there's competition based on lowering standards, is there?
I wouldn't say it's on the basis of lowering standards. It's probably more a case of, I guess there's a bit of intellectual property with each of the carriers in terms of how they deploy that service, and it was a case of, you know, how much of that intellectual property do you want to share with your competitors?
But intellectual property is intellectual property. Base standards for an industry is a different thing, isn't it?
Look, there's no question that as a licensed and accredited carrier, we have to satisfy a standard in deploying our fibre to the premise, and we provide a very good standard for our deployments. So there's no question at all. We're not looking to lower standards whatsoever. But it's more a case of sharing that IP with competitors.
So all your competitors set their own standards. NBN is now saying they want a standard.
Yep.
And isn't the minister basically saying, why don't you just get your act together and set a standard?
And we are in the process of doing that, but the way the legislation's drafted at present, it states that the minister will set that standard.
Isn't that because you have vacated the field and you can't get it up because of intellectual property, you can't get it up because of competition, you can't get it up because you don't trust each other? What else can the minister do? Just ignore that rabble over there. Just ignore the rabble.
Deteriorate.
Just ignore the rabble.
Debate across the room.
I'd like you to answer my question.
As I said, look, the industry.
Colleagues are ignoring you, Doug.
Yeah. So as I said, the industry is working on establishing that standard through the Communications Alliance. So that standard should be available. Is there a time frame on that, Peter?
I'm not aware of the time frame, but I know it's imminent.
But isn't it about the minister having a reserve power?
Well, I guess, I mean, it would be good if the legislation had a time frame by which industry could establish that standard. So perhaps that's a way of addressing that. You give us a time frame to establish that standard, and then if we don't establish that standard within that time frame, that the minister then has a reserve power.
I mean, we currently do meet standards in the industry as they are today, but I guess we also innovate, and
But what are the standards in the industry today?
well, there are Comms Alliance standards in the industry today.
But they're all different, aren't they? But there's different standards.
There are standards for pit and pipe type deployments in the industry today. Now, our ability to innovate, and I'll just give you a practical example of that, is, you know, if we decide that in deploying a network in a fibre in a new estate that we want to put 50 mil conduit because we believe that's all is required, then we shouldn't be dictated to deploy 100 mil conduit as a minimum requirement because that's an NBN code standard. You know, we should be able to innovate. We might, as Opticom indicated, we might put 5 pits in a certain area within our design and not 6 pits. So that's about innovation, and it's about being competitive in the market. It's about deploying a network that still meets standards, but
So it's more like cost cutting than innovation.
Well,
you put a 50 mil pipe in instead of 200 mil.
yeah, but why put 100 mil when you don't need?
What's innovative about that?
Why put 100 mil when you don't need 100 mil?
Yeah, but it's not innovation.
Stop waste, but your government
But it's not-
doesn't worry
it's not
about
innovation.
that.
Senator,
is
you'll
it?
get your opportunity.
It's innovation in the way you design your networks.
It's supposed to be chirpy, right?
I've never heard innovation being described in that way.
Look, I guess it's what I was saying before, in the sense that what we don't want to see happen, and it's the point that Peter's trying to make, is that we don't want to see over-engineering beyond what's required. So when Transact goes into a development, what we do is we design the deployment for that development. There's no point putting in an over-engineered solution if that development doesn't require that.
But do you agree if there is a national broadband network, there should be some standardisation in that network?
For the purposes of NBN Co, I can't speak for NBN Co, but I'm sure NBN Co will want a standard for what it's doing. The same way in which we set a standard for what we do. Yeah.
That's fine. Thanks.
Mr. Hudson.
Yeah, you mentioned a turnkey figure 1,500 to 3,000. What's the difference represent? UPS and RF overlay? How do you get from 1,500 to 3,000?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a number that we provide to developers, and there is that competitive framework at the moment. So obviously, like any service provision, one of the value propositions is that you provide it for a lower cost. And essentially what tends to happen now is that the developer will incorporate that cost in the cost of the building or the block that gets sold, or a house and land type package that gets deployed. That top end of the spectrum, I think, would represent more of a over-engineered, gold-plated, no other choice type
Yeah, well, what's
price.
the over-engineering and the gold plating is what I'm asking you.
And I think it's also depending on competition too, depending on how much competition there is. And obviously competition will drive prices down, because if you know that someone else is also bidding for the work, you're obviously going to be as keen as possible in terms of providing the lowest cost that will win you the business. But it's putting pit and pipe on both sides of the street, having lots of conduit under roads, having extra pits, having more fibre than what's required. It's those type of over-engineering that could get the price up to that higher number.
Is your view that over-engineering exists now with what's being proposed in terms of the rollout?
Well, what exists now is primarily private companies deploying into greenfield sites. And private companies are efficient with what they do in deploying, so I don't think that what has been deployed thus far for fibre to the premise has been over-engineered, no.
Right. Because I'm trying to grapple with 2 points that you've made. One is that you want to be able to have, if I understand this correctly, and you by all means correct me if I've misunderstood what you said earlier, which was that you wanted people who were building, like if, for example, Transact was involved in a greenfield site in the rollout of the network, that you'd set your own standard. But if you had subcontracting firms that you engaged in development sites to roll out Transact's network, you would expect them to follow your standards.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So don't you see that the contradiction of position where, in the absence of a Comms Alliance mandated standard, that you're asking NBN Co to do something that you're not prepared to do yourselves?
Yeah, no, there isn't a contradiction there. What we're saying is that in the current environment, a licensed and accredited carrier sets the standard which is appropriate. Moving forward, Transact would be prepared to abide by an industry standard that's set by the industry. What we're concerned with is a standard that is handed down unilaterally by the Minister or NBN Co.
Okay.
So we'd be happy in the future if Opticom, Transact, NBN Co, Telstra, Optus, all the carriers established a standard which was appropriate and which was satisfactory to ACMA, for example, then we would be prepared to abide by that standard. But we wouldn't want a unilateral, over-engineered standard to apply.
But Comms Alliance, which is made up of a range of different companies in this space, including NBN Co, which can then talk amongst each other about the development of a standard, they haven't done it yet. So what should happen if Comms Alliance, if the industry is unable to reach agreement or broadly unanimous agreement about standards, how should a standard be developed if your other concern then is that the Minister be involved in some way of being able to bring some standard to create a degree of uniformity in the rollout?
Well, I think having ability for that, and there is a draft standard that has been established by those carriers as part of that Communications Alliance. So my suggestion there would be perhaps you have a time frame for that standard to be established by the industry, and failing that standard being established, then perhaps have the Minister with the reserved right to come in and set the standard.
But you would accept there's a degree of risk that you would be anticipating government would wear, that in the instance where Comms Alliance, for example, was unable to, within its own internal fora, reach agreement on a standard, that we would be without standards under the scenario that you just outlined?
Well, no, I wouldn't say we're without standards. I mean, we do have Transact does. We are a licensed and accredited carrier. So absolutely, our standard has to be adequate, otherwise we run the risk of losing our licence. So, I mean, if Transact started rolling out dodgy fibre to the premise deployments that didn't meet the requirements, we'd be running the risk of losing our licence. So there is standards.
And also if it was, in that scenario, found that there were a higher level of, say, for example, higher incidence of faults that led to service standards not being met in terms of delivery of service, I mean, that would be an issue as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like if that was a situation where there was lots of faults and problems with what we were deploying, as I said, we would run the risk of threatening to lose our carrier's licence in that scenario.
Because that's the other issue that exists here, is that who actually, in the absence of, I hear clearly what you're saying, which is you don't want the Minister to be able to bring in a standard, but at the same time too, the industry has not yet reached a landing on what that standard would be. But if it did, who is ultimately responsible for if that standard is observed and that, say, for example, does lead to a higher incidence of fault and non-performance? What happens then?
Well, I think in that scenario it'd be ACMA that would come into the picture.
Okay.
I mean, there is currently a draft standard that's been set by the Comms Alliance. Maybe the question should be asked of NBN Co whether they're happy to comply with that particular standard as a minimum standard as it stands today. And maybe that can be referenced in the legislation.
Okay.
Can I know Senator Fisher would like to ask a question. I just want to follow on from that. You talked about the unilateral power of the Minister to impose these standards, but is it your understanding, because my reading of the bill is, and from my understanding the department submissions to this committee is that the bill does not impose specifications NBN Co specifications on the industry, and in fact the provisions in the bill give the minister a reserve power, and when it talks about NBN Co specifications, it's talking about those specifications being provided to the Communications Alliance for endorsement for general use. So how is that not really consistent with what you're saying? There's a reserve power so that if no one steps up, someone fills the void. The minister is able to ensure there is specifications out there, but NBN Co would be taking their specifications to the Communications Alliance, which my understanding of all the evidence I've heard today is that's what people want, that's what companies want, and would be seeking endorsement for that to be used generally.
Well, I mean, currently NBN Co have taken their guidelines, they're not really specifications, but their NBN Co guidelines, which they released in April this year, to the Comms Alliance Working Group. And the issue currently is that the Comms Alliance, members of the Comms Alliance Working Group don't all necessarily agree that those standards should be industry minimum standards. So that is the current issue. So what we're saying is that without a Comms Alliance standard, and we've proposed an amendment to this bill that the standards should be potentially those that or guidelines should be those of an existing licensed carrier, whether that be NBN Co. Therefore, Mr Developer goes to NBN Co and he would have to comply with NBN Co's guidelines for installation of pit and pipe of fibre-ready infrastructure. If it went to Transact, he'd have to comply with Transact's guidelines. Given that both those guidelines of both those companies still meet certain current standards in the industry, Comms Alliance standards that are there today.
Do you not accept, though, where the government is making such a major investment in infrastructure in this country, that it should be able to at least expect that there'd be an industry standard put out there in relation to that infrastructure, and not just leave it to each company and say, well, we can't agree, so we should be able to all do, you know, basically do our own thing?
Well, I think it. Well, I don't think it's a case of doing your own thing. I mean, we do have to meet standards. Otherwise, as I indicated before, we'd lose our carrier licence if we didn't meet those standards. My understanding of the concept and the position of the government is that NBN Co is to be a supplier of last resort, not the supplier of first resort into these greenfield estates. So it's Transact's intention is to continue to deploy in these greenfield sites to a standard, and we are an accredited licensed carrier, so we do have standards, and we have participated in this Comms Alliance standard, and we would be prepared to shift and say we'd abide by a Communications Alliance standard, but there is that standard that is established, and NBN Co, in terms of that investment, should only be going in estates where private companies haven't been able to deliver the service to the end customer.
Okay, thank you. Senator Fisher, did you have some
yeah, thanks,
questions?
Chair. Gentlemen, thanks. If Transact, for example, were to be chosen, if the government regime allowed Transact to be chosen as an alternate provider to NBN Co, so as that developer's preferred supplier, and you proceed, and so if that happened, what then would be, do you think should be the expectations by the developer and anyone else of Transact in the context of the Minister saying yesterday that for developments of 100 or more, NBN Co does the work, and a developer must reach an agreement with NBN Co that transfers ownership of the infrastructure to NBN Co. So if you were to stand in the shoes of NBN Co, which is what, as I understand, you want Transact to be able to do, although on your own terms and conditions, in terms of the product, if I can put it that way, what do you think should be the expectation of Transact if ownership of the pit and pipe were transferred?
Our position on this is that, and we understand with that Minister's clarification, is that sites under 100 will continue to be supplied via Telstra using copper, and over 100 NBN Co. It's not that NBN Co will be the supplier. It's our understanding that NBN Co will be the supplier of last resort. And I guess that's one of the issues for all the private companies, is that everyone seems to think that NBN Co will be the supplier of first resort into these greenfield estates.
Indeed,
and
at every resort.
Yeah, and what private companies would like to see is that that we supply greenfield estates, and if we don't get it right, then NBN Co comes in as a supplier of last resort. If for whatever reason the development is in the middle of nowhere and there's problems with backhaul to that site, or if it's too far for us because it's from an economics perspective we can't make it work, then NBN Co should be the supplier of last resort. But it seems to be what's happening now is that developers are saying, okay, NBN Co is going to do this, all we need to do is put in the pit and pipe and they'll do the rest. Whereas what we've provided is a turnkey solution to the developer. We don't require developers to put the pit and pipe in, we do it. We put in the pit and pipe, we put in the fibre, and we provide them a price per dwelling, which I haven't disclosed because of commercial in confidence reasons, and we provide that turnkey solutions. And then only in the situation where or the private industry has failed to do that, that's when the NBN Co should come in.
Now, if you get the opportunity to do that, clearly I'd have thought the inference of what you've just outlined would be that Transat would expect to maintain the pit and pipe as well as what's going through it.
Absolutely, that's exactly. I mean, we have 16,500 premises under contract, of which 4,500 have passed. We've got pit and pipe there, but that pit and pipe we put in, and we own it, and we put that in place, and the fibre and so forth, and the optical network termination units, and so forth, and the GPON gigabit passive optical network equipment we've put in and supplied that as a turnkey solution. And what developers do is take that cost into account when they sell their blocks.
Yeah, and so you're already shouldering that burden. Surely then you'd have some concerns about the fact that this bill doesn't touch that issue. Now, the government doesn't intend it to, yet yesterday the Minister, espoused forth that ownership of pits and pipes must be transferred back to NBN to NBN Co, without saying anything about who should bear the responsibility of maintenance thereafter. So do you have concerns about competitive playing field, because there seems to be a presumption that NBN Co will look after things thereafter, yet there seems to be no intent of giving them legislative compulsion to do that which you already do today.
Well, one of the amendments that we've asked for is that going back to the original draft legislation, which is whereby a capped financial contribution methodology or price threshold is provided per development, rather than the requirement to put in pit and pipe, and that avoids that whole issue of pit and pipe and maintenance and transfer. And I think at the moment we provide that turnkey solution, whereas by having this pit and pipe concept, you've introduced a third party again. So the developer needs to go to a third party, put in the pit and pipe, and then the fibre operator comes in.
Why do you call it turnkey?
Total end-to-end solution.
Yeah, so total end. So we.
Silly me, of course.
And look, it's one of those things that, and developers really value that as a proposition because they don't need to worry about the pit and pipe. We do that per our standard. And as I said, we'd be happy to comply with the Comms Alliance standard.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for attending today to assist the committee with its review of the fibre deployment bill. I don't think we had any questions on notice to our witnesses, which is great. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Our next witnesses will be the Department of Broadband Communications and Digital Economy.
Yep.
So, yeah. We're almost done. Oh, okay. Thanks. And Susan's leaving us by the looks of it. We're still right with numbers. How many do we need? 1, 2, and we've got... Okay, so we've got 6 at the moment and... I now welcome the representatives of the Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Pip Spence, I'm the First Assistant Secretary of the National Broadband Network Implementation Division.
Philip Mason, Assistant Secretary, NBN and Fibre Rollout Regulation Branch.
Liz O'Shea, Assistant Secretary, Shareholder and Policy Branch.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. We welcome the department back before us today, and Ms Spence, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
Thank you, yes I would.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to make a statement. I just have a few brief comments. The department has previously explained the purpose of the Fibre Deployment Bill at the committee's hearings on the 16th of May, and we have also provided clarifications around some misunderstandings about the bill and its policy context in our submission. We're happy to expand on those matters as the committee wishes. There are a couple of comments that I'd like to make in terms of framing our evidence. The first is that we should remember that we are moving from a world in which the default in new developments is the provision of copper infrastructure by Telstra and moving to a goal of the provision of fibre. The second comment is that the fibre in new development policy needs to be understood as part of the wider national broadband network policy. That policy, as the committee will appreciate, is directed at providing significantly improved broadband nationally at nationally uniform wholesale pricing and on an open access basis that supports retail competition. The government has established NBN Co as the vehicle to deliver its national policy. Following extensive consultation with stakeholders from April 2009 to June 2010, the government decided that NBN Co would need to provide an active role in the provision of infrastructure in new developments. A key benefit of this approach is that NBN Co can bring to bear in new developments the strengths of its national approach and scale. In many ways, this is similar to the approach that Telstra in the past has taken to servicing new developments as a national carrier. I know the committee has already asked some questions about a media release issued this week by the Minister for Broadband, Communications and the Digital Economy. I would like to emphasise that the media release does not make any fundamental changes to the implementation arrangements announced last December. Further, the statement does not affect the bill that is currently before the Parliament. Basically, the arrangements announced yesterday clarify the division of provider of last resort responsibilities between NBN Co and Telstra in new developments in the light of experience on the ground in the past few months. The key points of this clarification are that NBN Co is responsible as fibre provider of last resort in new developments of 100 or more lots approved after 1 January. Telstra is responsible for developments under 100 lots approved after 1 January. Telstra will also look after any remaining developments that were approved before 1 January 2011. These clarifications address some uncertainties that stakeholders had about the juncture between NBN Co and Telstra responsibilities. Developers are, as always, free to use any provider. These arrangements refer only to NBN Co and Telstra as providers of last resort. I'd like to thank the committee again for the opportunity to make this statement, and we're happy to answer the committee's questions to the extent that we can.
Thank you very much. Questions from members? Mr Turnbull.
Firstly, Ms Spence, what is the arrangement with multi-dwelling units? And if there was a block of flats
Yep.
with more than 100 apartments in it. What's the arrangement there?
The arrangement is the same. Basically, the thresholds relate to lots, for example, if it's just land, and units, including if it's in multi-dwelling.
So if you have a block of apartments with 100 home units, the builder would be, or developer would be required to make the pipe, I guess it wouldn't be pit and pipe, it would be pipe infrastructure in the building suitable to carry the NBN fibre, and then the NBN would pull that fibre through into all of the apartments. Is that right?
You're talking about in terms of the policy or in terms of the requirements under the bill?
Well, I'm talking about both.
Okay.
Which is what you've been talking about, or your colleague has.
Under the bill, the objective, as has been discussed, is to ensure there's fibre-ready pit and pipe. So that's both within the development up to the property boundary, and then within the property boundary, basically from the outside of that boundary up to what's the network boundary point. So in a multi-dwelling unit, that can vary, but usually there's a kind of distribution frame there. So that's what's covered by the bill.
Well, sorry, does that mean a distribution frame in the basement, you mean?
Yes.
So
or some kind of equipment.
So you're not proposing to have fibre into apartments now?
No, that's not what I said.
No, well, just explain to me what you mean. Yep. I mean, as I understand it, the objective is to have fibre into each apartment, correct?
Yes.
That's correct.
Right. So is it the obligation of the developer to provide the fibre-ready NBN standard conduit that goes presumably from the street, the beginning of the buildings lot, into each apartment?
Yeah. I think it actually goes to a question you asked one of the earlier witnesses. The bill goes to that demarcation point within the basement of the building. With a fibre network, you would have some kind of fibre splitter or facility there. And then in relation to the building generally, there are already standards in relation to the distribution of fibre, as I recall. I think there's a document that's been put out under the auspices of the Australian Building Codes Board, which I think was developed by Victoria.
Okay, but the NBN will pull that fibre through into each apartment?
That's the objective of the NBN, but that's not really a matter covered by the bill.
Well, can you just answer that question? I mean, there's a lot.
Well, yes.
There are more apartments being built than
yes,
houses on lots and subdivisions.
Yeah, the objective of the NBN is to provide fibre to the premises, and in a multi-dwelling unit, that would be an individual unit.
Okay, all right. So the developer, if there's 100 units or more in the building, the developer makes the conduit available, and then the NBN will come along and pull that fibre through into each apartment.
Yes, but I think it's no different really to the way telecommunications is provided today. If a developer builds a multi-dwelling apartment block, they put risers in and so forth, conduit to provide for the reticulation of whatever infrastructure is installed there. Yeah. So, for example, Transact in Canberra, I believe, services a large number of apartment buildings, and I would assume they have access to those risers.
Yeah, look, please, you don't have to debate with me. I'm just trying to get a clear answer to the question. So the answer to my question, can you just tell me yes or no? If the developer provides the infrastructure, the conduit infrastructure to NBN standards in a apartment development for 100 units or more, will the NBN then pull the fibre through and terminate the fibre within each apartment?
I think yes, the answer is yes,
Yes,
within the 93%.
That's all I needed to know. That's all. Now, the second thing I wanted to put to you is thank you. I'm sorry that took so. I'm sorry it took so long.
He's a lawyer.
I'm sorry it took so long. But the next now, were you here when I was describing? Because I don't want to waste your time. Were you here when I was describing an amendment that we've been considering, which would have the effect of requiring or enabling a developer to get a contractor to do pit and pipe and fibre in accordance with the standards suitable to the NBN, to do that themselves off their own motion and then have the ability to, in effect, require the NBN to acquire that from them.
We weren't here.
Oh, you weren't here?
No, we were. We did hear some of it, but I don't think we'd heard the detail.
Okay, well, let me describe it then. I'll just try and be very concise here. Okay. A number of developers have complained about uncertainty and delay, naturally, and a concern about the timeliness with which the NBN would respond to requests to put fibre in. There have also been concerns expressed, and most recently by Transact, about the efficiency of having a developer get a contractor A to do the pit and pipe, and then presumably for NBN to employ contractor B to put in the fibre. And, you know, Transact, you might have heard them say, Mr Slavic just say a moment ago, it's much more efficient if one contractor does it all at once. That sort of seems to make a lot of sense. Other developers have expressed concern that they will be disadvantaged if their development is, say, 99 units or lots, and they get Telstra copper for, you know, what could be quite a long period before the NBN fibre is completely rolled out, and the development up the road has got the NBN fibre, and so they're therefore at a marketing disadvantage. And they've said, why can't we simply get a contractor to put the fibre in and then require the NBN to, and then have the option of either running it ourselves, which, as you said, they do at the moment, and that's not being interfered with, but also have the option of putting that to NBN, in other words, requiring NBN to acquire it from them. Now that's been, or purchase it from them, yeah. Now that's been welcomed by the developers, naturally, and I just wanted to see what your reaction was to that.
Well, first, I don't really think I'm in a position to make a comment on an effectively alternative policy proposal. I can talk about what the provisions in the bill are and how they operate.
Well, can you? Okay.
And the next point that I wanted to make is really the model that you seem to be describing doesn't really line up with what the point of the bill is, which is silent on the responsibilities of which carrier does what. It simply focuses on making sure that the fibre-ready infrastructure is provided and leaves the way open for developers to ensure that fibre is made available, to make sure that the fibre-ready infrastructure is provided and then the fibre will be installed.
Yeah, but you can understand developers are concerned about the delay and the discrimination between developments of 100 lots or more and those with less than 100 lots.
The other point that I'd make is one of the ones that I mentioned in my opening statement, which is really, we have to remember the default is at the moment copper, and we're moving towards a goal of installing fibre. So I wouldn't see it as a discrimination. I'd actually say that what we're trying to do is move to a world where fibre is installed as the first preference.
Well,
but at the moment,
it is a discrimination. I mean, we know it's a discrimination. How material it is another thing. But developers say that, you know, that puts them at a disadvantage from a marketing point of view, because the larger development can say, we've got fibre, and there seems to be a lot of effort being made to extol the virtues of fibre to the home at the moment. And if the guy down the road doesn't have that, he's at a disadvantage. So I'm just saying, well, look, you don't have instructions to comment on this, but this is an amendment. You know, if you've got a strong view as to why that's, or your department or your minister has a strong view as to why that's inappropriate, you might let us know, because I think it has quite a lot of appeal.
as I said, it doesn't fit in with the way in which the bill's constructed. Philip, did you want to add anything?
The only other comment I was going to make is that the thresholds that have been put in relation to the provision of fibre, they don't preclude having anybody put fibre in anywhere, really. I mean, I understand the issue you're raising, but if a developer of a smaller estate wants to have fibre put in, they're still free to do so.
Yeah, the problem, Mr Mason, though, is from a practical point of view, a developer could do a deal with Transact or Opticom and they would run a network for them, but that will be at a cost. And to justify that, the owner of the development would have to be satisfied that there were some additional services that could be run over that privately owned network that mightn't be available over the NBN. And I imagine a lot of developers, particularly in multi-dwelling units, will be inclined to say we want to have the fibre, and we just as happy to be part of the NBN scheme. In those circumstances, what skin is it off the government's nose, or indeed the NBN's nose, if the developer can get the fibre infrastructure built as quickly, in a timely way, not having to wait for the NBN to show up, but just get it done. It's done in accordance with the relevant specs. Why can't they then get reimbursed for that on some agreed schedule? Pardon? At cost? No, well, I think that Mr Husick, that's a very good... Mr Husick asks whether it's at cost or not. That would obviously be that'd be a perfectly legitimate way of doing it. What's been suggested by, and I wouldn't be troubled by that. You might want to put some sort of cap on it, but an alternative might be just to agree on a tariff, and the industry's talked about a sum. I think my recollection was, don't hold me to this, was it was $1,500 per lot. Now, this is, if we were to take this further, this is something that we'd need some more advice on, but it would enable, from your point of view, as a department, it would seem to me to enable the market to roll out more fibre more quickly in a more timely way in greenfield sites, which I assume is, the bigger objective. That's all I had. It's the only matter I had to say.
I know you can't comment on policy, but were these sort of things considered in your frank and fearless advice to the Minister? Did you go through those? Were they options? If they were, is there a reason they were rejected that we haven't quite been able to work out?
What I can say is there was, as I've mentioned before, there was extensive consultation with the wide range of stakeholders involved in this policy, which many of which come from quite different perspectives. Those views were taken into account in reaching the policy and arrangements which were announced in December 2010.
Did you hear the evidence about the NBN standard, the standard and the suggestion that Comms Alliance would be a better guide rather than leaving it to the Minister, and then perhaps through that meaning effectively that it's the NBN that sets that standard? Did you hear that evidence?
We did, and I think Mr Mason's quite keen to clarify the provisions in the bill.
But I know Senator Cameron's been getting instructions from the Minister's office on his computer about it, so I suspect we've already got the answer, but fire away. Let's hear Mr Mason's.
Yes, we heard some of the evidence. We've also read in the submissions where this issue was raised as well. Yep. The scope in the bill for the Minister to make standards, as we explained in our submission, is really there as a reserve mechanism. Yeah. I think as it became apparent from the testimony from some of the witnesses I've heard, there are actually multiple industry practices or specifications that a range of different carriers are using. There isn't actually a standard as I understand it. What I think Comms Alliance has at the moment are some guidelines which actually aren't binding, and I'm not quite sure they've been finalised. There are also some other standards in the background which are relevant, but there isn't actually a standard as such for the fibre-ready pit and pipe, I think, which is the government's main concern. So what we're faced with, I guess, is a situation where we're trying to get developers to put in fibre-ready pit and pipe in anticipation of fibre being rolled out in the future, but we don't actually have an industry standard. And it may take some time to do, because the usual process for the development of standards and so forth are that Comms Alliance get together the interested industry parties, which they have done for some time and have been working on it, and I give them due credit for that. And then once they have a satisfactory document, it goes out for public consultation, as I understand it, and so there's that time frame required. And then usually there's further reworking of that standard to make sure all those views are taken into account, and then it goes off to the ACMA for codification or for registration as a code. And so then, from memory, the ACMA must undertake the consultation process as well. So that takes time as well. If the code practice, I think someone asked, well, what happens if the multiple carriers in the industry can't agree? The default then is that the ACMA can make a standard. And the ACMA usually can start off with the kind of Comms Alliance code or something like that, and then it goes through a similar process. So unless everything goes perfectly, it could take a very long time. In the meantime, we're trying to get fibre rolled out. We want to make sure the pit and pipe is there, ready for that fibre, but we might not have a standard. So the Minister's power was to deal with that possible gap period. In our submission, I think we pointed out that the government has said publicly its preference is for those established industry processes to work. In fact, the government actually amended the Part 6 processes under which these codes and standards are made in the NBN Co-Access Bill that was enacted in April to broaden the scope of things the ACMA can actually cover in those codes and standards. So I would, and those provisions were actually in an earlier version of this fibre deployment bill as well to again facilitate that process.
Why were they? Why?
On this Transact, we're making out, or putting the point fairly strongly that they were of the view that the Minister would make the standard. But can I just clarify, did you just say ACMA would have the greatest influence in terms of the standard? Sorry, Senator.
So I want to be perfectly clear. The bill does contain powers for the Minister to be able to say these are the codes that apply to this type of infrastructure. Okay, but it also says, and I was looking for the reference in the EM, but I'm sorry I couldn't find it. But the Minister can do that by referring to existing industry guidelines. So, for example, Comms Alliance have some guidelines that aren't actually codes or standards. If everyone was in agreement that they were fine, the Minister could say, pending something being done formally, that is the guidance.
Well, he could do that.
Yes, he could.
But then he may not.
Well,
and that's what I think the industry is worried about. I mean, were you attracted to the suggestion by one of the witnesses that, you know, perhaps it's a sunset clause thing, that, you know, the Minister should have power, but if the industry can get a recognised standard by X a date, then that standard will apply and the Minister's power will thereafter abate?
I don't see any problem in principle with that. I think our concern is the lack of the industry code or standard. And sorry, there's another point to be made as well. I think, you know, both Opticom and Transact pointed out that they're established carriers who have done a lot of this work and have a lot of experience. That's perfectly true, and you know, I agree with that. They do very good work. The problem is, though, the bill, the way it operates, is about developers ensuring that fibre-ready pit and pipe is put in place. It doesn't say that you have to actually go and get a registered carrier to go and do that. You know, basically, they can go to any contractor and say, well, we want to make sure this pit and pipe is in place, go off and do it. And so the contractor says, well, what standards do we use? And then the developer says, well, not quite sure, because their Comms Alliance have only got guidelines. So that was another mechanism.
Well, yes, I mean,
another role that it would play.
You've said that, but as I understood from the witnesses, they're not far away, and perhaps given a bit of, you know, sunset clause encouragement, perhaps it could be done much more quickly. Or perhaps, as I say, it could be, you know, the Minister will apply until such time before a certain date this comes, and if it isn't there by a certain date, then it stays as it is. But the industry is naturally, I think, concerned that as time wears on, that it becomes the Minister's standard, which, taking his advice, no doubt, from his his principal advisor, the NBN code, becomes the NBN standard, and the industry is concerned that the NBN standard may be too severe, not severe enough or whatever. And there seemed to be some merit in what they were saying about their concern of the minister, i.e. the NBN standard, becoming the norm.
Well, I can only say that the stated preference is to use industry codes and standards, and the provisions in the bill are there as a reserve power, and I understand those concerns, but I don't agree with them.
So, well, you don't agree with them. Okay, I was going to say, so your advice to the minister would be, and I know I shouldn't be asking you what your advice to the minister might be, but if an amendment came that said, let's encourage the industry to get their standard together. It's a peer-reviewed standard as opposed to the NBN's minister standard, which would hardly seem to be peer-reviewed. Perhaps there might be some merit in trying to accommodate the industry.
Senator, I agree. We have been actively encouraging the industry to come up with these standards and specifications, and as I said, we've actually amended the relevant part of the Telecommunications Act to make it easier for it to happen. And look, I think everybody has all been very diligent and keen to get on with this. I'm not criticising the industry players. It has actually been happening. It's just taking time. And so in some ways the issue is about getting in place a framework to get fibre-ready infrastructure put in place as soon as we can to facilitate the rollout of fibre, and the time it actually takes to get standards and codes and things in place given the way it operates. But in relation to that question about NBN code specifications, I think one of the proposals in the Transact submission, for example, was that you could say any code or specifications of a licensed carrier would be appropriate. I mean, if you did that, you would actually be saying for NBN code, then NBN code specifications are fine for it. Similarly, Transact. So,
well, I accept that, and that's why the peer-reviewed Commons Alliance thing would be, in my view, or in the view of the witnesses, which they've convinced me would be a better way. But perhaps your evidence might be an invitation to the industry to actually get their well, let me put this in parliamentary, to encourage the industry to hasten their efforts to come up with some sort of proposal that might attract the support of the majority of Parliament with an amendment.
And I understand that, and I just wanted to make clear that I think the industry players are actually very active in trying to resolve this issue through the Comms Alliance. People like Transact and Telstra and NBN Co and Opticom, and Phil Smith mentioned he was the chair of that development group, are very active. I don't want to cast aspersions on their enthusiasm. It's just the process actually takes time.
Well, you haven't, but I mean, all of them seem to have made a point about it, so they're clearly worried for reasons that they understand better than I might say. Anyhow, look, thanks for that. Sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No. Before I hand over, though, to Mr Husik, can I just put one question to you, because there's been a lot of questions put to the witnesses today in relation to proposed amendments, consideration of provisions being put forward in this bill relating to fibre providers, as opposed to the current purpose of the bill, which is really establishing the provider for the fibre-ready infrastructure. What we've also heard from the witnesses is that there has been a lot of uncertainty out there because of the delay in this bill. And what I'm interested to hear from the department is understanding that there is a lot of interest out there about having some specifics about fibre providers, how it's all going to work. If we are going to go down the track of opening up this bill to consider it widening its scope and dealing with fibre providers as well as the fibre-ready infrastructure, what sort of delays are we expecting in this bill? And do we expect that that's going to, because we've seen some submissions that it's really a critical point, they need some certainty. what this is going to do for industries out there as far as uncertainty if we go down that path.
Well, I think clearly the desire for certainty around this entire arrangements has been raised by witnesses today and previously, and our view is the mix between what's in the policy statement, which provides clarity around provider of last resort responsibilities for Telstra and NBN Co, while leaving it open for other providers to meet developers' needs in terms of rolling out fibre networks, is one part of the equation, and then the other part of the equation is the bill in its current form, which sets out the framework for the provision of the fibre-ready infrastructure. To change those arrangements would be quite a fundamental shift in the nature of the bill, is my view, and would slow things down and add to the potential lack of clarity for developers going forward.
If we were to go down the path, because obviously you'd need to make substantive amendments to the bill to start looking at widening its scope to deal with that area as well, we would be looking at this bill not being enacted till near the end of the year. Would that be a reasonable expectation? Considering we're about to go into the winter break?
Yeah, it doesn't seem an unreasonable assumption that it could. It would take it would depend on drafting resources, but could potentially significantly delay.
Drafting resources if you don't have the sufficient ones.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Mr Hughes.
I was just going to ask, Senator McDonald put forward two propositions. One, I think I wouldn't mind pursuing further. The other one I think would be problematic, and the problematic one would be this sunset arrangement, which I think contains within it an element of risk if the industry doesn't get its act together on coming up with a standard. But given that standards do evolve, I come back to the other point he advanced to you, which I think wanted to follow up, and that is, as the standards evolve, as industry consensus develops or forms, is there a scope for those industry standards to then become embraced within legislation or within terms of the way the department's working, based on, I think, some of your comments from earlier, Mr Mason?
Yes, look, I think the bill and the minister's powers in the bill really are reserved power. The default is if there is an industry code or a standard, then it will actually apply to a carrier in particular. So
what you're saying is there is a prospect that so it's reserved power, the preference is that the industry put forward what it believes is workable?
Yes.
Okay. In relation to...
So to set out a timetable, for example, if there weren't an industry code or standard, then the minister could put in place some kind of default arrangement which might apply to the guidelines, which are actually currently voluntary at the moment. If the code and so forth came into force, then they would actually apply to carriers and people generally. And because they apply to carriers, the people who put in the pit and pipe for carriers would have to comply with them. And then those things evolve over time. That's how Comms Alliance codes work.
Well, I know Minister Conroy can do a stack of different things, but I don't imagine he'd want to be spending all his day coming up with standards on his own. So in the instance... See, I threw the bait out and in comes a barracuda.
Barracuda's an ice fish.
But if I can just say, if I can ask you, in terms of like if he was to exercise his powers, how would he go about doing that? That is, this would not occur in a vacuum. Am I right to understand that?
Yes, that would be correct.
What would inform his decision-making process?
Well, the usual process would be to consult with the stakeholders and identify what any kind of relevant specifications would be. And I guess from our perspective, we would be looking at pre-existing models. And again, I would refer to the Comms Alliance guidelines. Or other carriers' specifications, and there's a range of those, and then you would draft up some kind of instrument that would probably refer to those documents, and then the usual process would be to consult on it. And given the nature of this matter, I'm sure there would be lots of feedback. And that in itself is actually a time-consuming process, so maybe Comms Alliance will have its code and standards in place by then.
Well, because there is a great degree of risk if they can't get their act together, you then need to scramble to develop your own standards, don't you? If they're
Well, I don't think anyone would presume to do that. I mean, we would obviously look at the work that exists. Otherwise, if you had to go back to start from scratch, it would be a very time-consuming process.
Okay. The other question, the other thing, just following on from this too, is NBN, from memory, you may be aware of this or not, they're members of the International Telecommunications Union, right?
I'm not sure of that, sorry.
But the ITU does...
Australia is a member.
Australia's a member, but the ITU is also involved in setting standards based on what occurs internationally too, correct? Or observing what is... So we're not necessarily doing something that is necessarily too bravely lateral, like we will work in understood practice or common practice, correct?
Yes.
Or is that more about broadcasting?
Well, no, I think ITU standards, I don't know. The main issue that seems to be in contention at the moment is in relation to pit and pipe, which is actually pretty, basic infrastructure in some ways. I don't know personally if there is an ITU standard in relation to pit and pipe infrastructure.
And the cabling.
It's
well,
usually,
the cabling probably, but...
There could well be, and I think the other issue of ITU, because it's a global organisation, obviously it's at a very high level as well. The sand in Mali may not be as quite the same as...
The other thing I wanted to ask was about, while Transact has a capability to perform pit and pipe and cabling, that's not... Is that the standard configuration in terms of companies performing this type of work? That they would have on board, besides the people who would do the boring, that have people who could do the backhaul, all in one, the cabling, within the pits?
I think you'd... Usually, I think a lot of that work is actually subcontracted out. And I think one of the issues with the standards question is that because this pit and pipe can actually be sourced from people other than carriers, that's why the standards question is actually a bit of a larger question. So yes, if a developer went to, and it goes to how a developer wants to tackle the issue as well. It could go to a provider that offers a turnkey solution like Transact or Opticom or somebody like that, or NBN Co, or it could go say, well, we actually can get the pit and pipe done separately under a tender or something like that, and so it goes off to somebody else to get that done, and they need to have some guidance as to what the pit and pipe is that's put in place.
I know many years ago there was the regulator in its previous form as Austel put out, or they had shared duct protocols. Those protocols evolved, and that within developments, there would be space allowed for, in terms of one duct, the provision of different utility services, be it electricity, like telecommunications asset. Is that shared duct type protocol still in existence?
I don't know about that protocol itself, I'm sorry, but I do know that it is of interest to the participants in the early stages development working group in Comms Alliance, and it's actually being considered in the context of this, the specifications they're developing. So it is a live issue, but I think the point is they actually are trying to pin it down better.
The only reason I ask is because I'd imagine that there'd be huge cost savings in being able to get that asset where you're able to get the providers ready to do all that work simultaneously.
Yes, the objective of the Working Comms Alliance is to facilitate that kind of access to shared trenching.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Senator Fisher, you had some questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Department. My questions are largely around the Minister's press release of yesterday. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it? Sorry, 17th, to which I referred with some of the witnesses earlier. So is it the government's intent, so is it policy that infrastructure that's already filled with fibre by a developer or is empty, i.e. empty pits and pipes ready for fibre, is it the government's intent, is it policy that infrastructure be acquired by NBN Co or Telstra, depending upon the size of the greenfields development, be acquired by NBN Co or Telstra prior to, is it the intention that it be acquired, ownership of it by Telstra? Sorry, by NBN Co or Telstra, depending.
Yep. The answer to the question is the press release is responding to new pit and pipe, not pre-existing pit and pipe that has other people's facilities in it. Or so the scenario would be a new development is established. The developer wants to use Telstra or NBN Co, and then the arrangement would be that they provide the pit and pipe or meet the cost of providing the pit and pipe, and that the ownership of that is transferred to the carrier who would be providing the first fixed line there, whether it be NBN Co or Telstra, depending on the scenario. And I would just add that if they want to use another provider, which they're free to do obviously, then the ownership of the pit and pipe would be a matter between the developers and that provider. So I think Transact, for example, just said that if it provides a turnkey solution, then it provides the pit and pipe as part of that. And I understood from what they said they retained ownership of that. But
Currently. Yeah. Okay.
Well, there's no suggestion that pit and pipe owned by Transact would be transferred to anybody.
No, and I haven't suggested that or asked about that. It's more whether Transact would stand in the same shoes, if you like, as NBN Co. I'm sure they wouldn't think well, we've heard from them that they don't think they would be under the government's regime, or could be, but in this context I was trying to reassure myself that Transact, for example, would essentially be able to stand in the shoes of NBN Co just in this respect, and you're confirming that. Okay, so the answer is yes. So does that mean, if that then happens, does that mean that NBN Co will maintain the pit and pipe and at NBN Co's cost?
That would be the expectation, yes. If you own that infrastructure, you would look after it to maintain quality of service and avoid liability, for example, people falling in manholes. You
would think so. So that gets me to the next question. So will the developer bear any sort of responsibility in respect of the pit and pipe after the transfer of ownership to NBN Co?
As far as I know, the ownership is transferred to NBN Co under its contract, and NBN Co would be responsible, but I must confess I haven't seen the details of the contract.
We wouldn't expect that the developer would retain responsibility, but we don't actually have anything documented to...
for any risks at all, for example. Can you answer that on notice? Confirm on notice that a post-transfer of pit and pipe, the developer would not bear any sort of leftover responsibility?
We'll certainly see what we can find out on that.
Thank you. Now, you've referred to the agreement. Is that already drafted? Is it public?
Sorry?
The agreements between NBN Co and developers...
yes, and Mr Mason, you said you haven't seen, or Ms Spence might have, one of you said you haven't seen the agreement. Does it exist? Can we have a copy?
Yes, there are agreements. NBN Co has been talking to developers for many months.
Can we see copies of... So I understand you to be saying that the sorts of agreements effectively to which the Minister refers in his press release, pursuant to an agreement with NBN Co to provide fibre in the new estate, developers will need to transfer ownership of the pit and pipe to NBN Co pursuant to an agreement with NBN Co to provide fibre in the new estate. So you're saying there are agreements of that sort in existence today, Mr Mason?
Senator, can I just make the point that the matters that you're going to are largely matters for NBN Co and the way in which it's taking forward its responsibility. So while we'll be happy to talk to NBN Co about it, these are matters that go beyond the responsibility of the department.
I hear you on that, Ms Spence, but I guess in the view of some previous witnesses, they'd be saying, well, it falls within the province of this bill. So I guess that's why I'm asking you. It should fall with these issues should fall within the province of this bill, even though they don't.
Well,
so that's why I'm asking you about it.
And as I said, we will talk to NBN Co, but they do go, and also they fall into the sort of the broader policy as opposed to the provisions in the bill. But we'll certainly, as I said, we'll talk to NBN Co and come back with any further information that we can.
Well, actually, I guess I'm still in time to ask questions on notice in an estimates context of NBN Co, given the belated hearing last night. So what I might also do to make sure we get a response is ask the same question of NBN Co. In terms of copies of agreements, please, but if it comes as rapidly as answers to questions on notice have in the past, in an estimates context, I'd look forward to getting it a whole lot earlier from you guys if you can. Okay, so you don't think that developers would bear any risk post-transfer, then will the developer or perhaps the individual property owners or the body corporate be able to have access post-transfer to the pits and pipes, and unrestricted access? For example, they might want to retain the use of return-to-base security lines or a body corporate internet or cable TV.
We're not in a position to comment on that. That would be a matter for the contract.
So what's the government's policy?
Well, the government's policy is that NBN Co provides fibre as a provider of last resort, and it has a commercial basis of doing that, of asking for a transfer of ownership of pit and pipe.
Commercial, right. So it's a matter for the contract, did you say, Mr Mason?
Well, I would assume that it would be covered in the contract if it's covered.
Because, of course, the next question is, even if developers or property owners are able to have access to the acquired pit and pipe, to the NBN Co acquired pit and pipe thereafter, that begs the question of whether they will be required to pay a fee for that access. Do you have a response to that? Or a commission, or a maintenance charge, or money, however you carve it?
Well, I have an answer, which is the basis on which the policy is formed is that NBN Co seeks the ownership of that pit and pipe, and I guess the owner of property generally controls access to it.
Even though the developer may have paid for it in the first place?
Well, that's the basis on which NBN Co will be providing fibre.
Okay.
And the developer does have to reach an agreement with NBN Co on the basis in which the ownership is transferred. So if the developer has a concern, then that's a matter for the commercial agreement that they enter into for the transfer of the ownership.
All right, thank you. And I guess it's pretty obvious from what you've been saying that to the extent that you have been able to give a definitive answer to my questions, it's not legislated anywhere. It's your understanding of the government's policy.
Sorry, to mandate a transfer of ownership. It's a policy approach. It's policy, but it goes back to the terms and conditions on which NBN Co would provide fibre.
So where's it legislated that post, or where is it mandated, use your terminology, which is fine, where is it mandated that post-acquisition of pit and pipe, NBN Co carries responsibility to maintain thereafter?
I think the point that Mr Mason made earlier is generally as the owner of the infrastructure, they're responsible for the infrastructure, including of maintenance. It's in their interest to maintain the pit and pipe so that there's no problems with the fibre that it's reticulated through that pit and pipe.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your answers. Will Telstra or NBN Co, depending on the size of the development, provide to a developer any backhauling that might be needed to get optical or copper to a development, if it's needed?
The responsibilities go to providing infrastructure and services needed to provide services to end users. So in the case of Telstra, yes, it would be providing active services that interconnect with networks that would have to be backhaul, and similarly with NBN Co, it needs to provide backhaul to the wider network. And I just make the distinction because obviously NBN Co is wholesale only, whereas Telstra also has a retail.
They wouldn't be charging, neither would charge the developer for that?
That's right, Senator. I think if you go back to the June 2010 policy statement, it made that clear.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Yes?
In developing the legislation, did you inform yourself on the processes that are used by similar utilities in relation to the provision of assets in greenfield sites?
Yes, we did actually look at how other utilities are provided, but as you mentioned, it was in the process of developing the legislation, and this is actually the second time we've been through this bill. So my memory of some of the details is a little hazy, but we certainly looked at those arrangements.
Okay. The way that they interact with developers, the way that developers may, for example, in their own roll out asset or provide the asset.
Yes.
And then
what developer contributions were made to, for example, roads, footpaths, parkland, power utilities, water, gas, etc. Yes.
Because this is, again, not a foreign concept. I mean, from memory, I think in New South Wales, the New South Wales regulator IPART has a say in developer contributions when they're rolling out asset and then hand them over to a distributor, for instance.
Yes, I think that's true in a general sense. My understanding, and as I said, it's some time since we looked at that, but basically developers meet a large proportion of distribution infrastructure costs in the development and often make a contribution to head-end costs, I guess. I think, facilities that are off the development, for example, provision of water storage and so forth, but that's my general understanding.
Okay. Thank you.
And yes, I think the development organisations would be better placed to answer those questions.
No, that's fine. It would have been good for others to hear what you just said, that's all.
It's all on transcript.
Good thing is Mary James here.
Thank you
Senator
for
Fisher.
attending today to assist the committee with its review of the fibre deployment bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is it the wish of the committee to authorise for publication, including publication on the parliamentary database, the proof of the transcript of evidence given before it at the public hearing today? There being no objection, it is so resolved. I would like to thank my colleagues and all witnesses for their time today and declare this public hearing closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.